he lied about the contents of a letter that Charlie Kirk had written him back in May. They were not happy with Charlie at the end of this weekend in the Hamptons. And until we have all the facts in front of us, until we actually see the footage, I think we should be careful in just thinking that everybody is guilty of something.
Candace Owens just exposed the high-level pro-Israel pressure campaign against Charlie Kirk in the final days of his life. And in this clip, she gets into some of the lies Netanyahu has told about Charlie and why it's probably a bad idea to just jump to conclusions about who is culpable in his death. So let's get a look at this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
There's a lot of leaking going on right now, and I've been very clear that everything in my soul has been screaming at me from the very moment that I found out that Charlie got shot, that this story is much bigger, that there just was something much bigger going on than what has thus far been presented to the public. You know, all of the wrong people are eulogizing him. They're lying about small things, which I don't like, because why lie about small things? Only a guilty conscience of sorts lies about little things. And there are a few points that we have covered throughout the story that right away jumped out at me as odd. First and foremost, of course, Bibi Netanyahu over-inserting himself, not even just on day one, minute one. He tweeted before the president of the United States that Charlie had lost his life. That's weird. That is very weird, and we should not forget how weird that is, especially because when he went on multiple hits, doing Fox News and Greta Van Sustern's show, he lied about the contents of a letter that Charlie Kirk had written him back in May. What I also don't like are the people like Josh Hammer and Seth Dillon, people that I know who are very nasty and work behind the scenes. I don't like that they have not yet been honest or forthcoming about the pressure that they and others were putting on Charlie Kirk. That just strikes me as odd. There's no reason to lie. No reason to pretend that you weren't doing that, to try to massage it and lie about it. I believe that there are lies by omission.
Yeah, I mean, their reason is pretty clear. It's to draw suspicions away from them and the culpability they had in trying to drive him in a more pro-Israel direction than he even was. A pretty pro-Israel guy, by the way. He couldn't stop talking about it, including several days before his death with Ben Shapiro, lobbing him softball questions about how we should, do away with this idea that there's a genocide in Gaza and, how do we know, we can trust Israel and the media? Just lobbing these softballs for Ben Shapiro to answer with classical Zionist tropes. But yeah, she is right. I mean, the weirdest thing about the Netanyahu appearances, in two separate clips, he makes reference to that note she talks about that he received from Charlie Kirk, in both times saying that, he invited Charlie to Israel, and unfortunately that wasn't going to happen now. But, several people close to him that have reported to journalists and, told journalists about this incident, he grew to despise Netanyahu. He grew to view him as a bully. Max Blumenthal talks about it in his first piece, talking to the unnamed source here. And in this follow-up piece on September 22nd, he said that Kirk was subjected to an almost daily lobbying campaign from Netanyahu's allies, the people closest to Netanyahu. So yeah, he was inundated by this, steer more toward the Zionist Ben Shapiro, Mark Levin direction or else. I don't think it's that weird that he tweeted, "Please pray for Charlie Kirk," 39 minutes after Kirk was shot. I've talked about that before. I have every reason to loathe Netanyahu. I think he's a war criminal. He's a vile monster that deserves to be behind bars for life. He's guilty of drawing the U.S. into wars and ethnically cleansing a people. But, this was after Mike Lee and Pete Hegseth and some other people of prominence were saying, pray for Charlie Kirk. There was a lot of, hullabaloo, obviously, about this on Twitter. But that said, I mostly agree with Candace here.
And I view them both to be liars, okay? And of course, who could forget the word length of Bill Ackman's reply? I tell you guys about this weekend in the Hamptons. I tell you about Bibi Netanyahu calling Charlie Kirk and inviting him to Israel. And Bill Ackman replies with an essay, a college essay, 959 words to be precise, was his response to me speaking about that, where he himself did not actually address my point about the quote-unquote intervention, which is how Charlie described it himself, and my point about Bibi Netanyahu and the offer to take Turning Point to the next level financially. No one wants to address those points because I was being honest. People thought that Charlie's ideas were trending in the wrong direction. And by the way, regarding that now infamous weekend, the response videos that were made, which seemed like there was some sort of a PR crisis going on, the response tweets that were fashioned, they were sort of getting funny. Xavier DeRusso was there. I had reached out to him. He had, rather than answering me, messaged me to say, I am speaking out about that weekend. He made a video where he formally addressed the weekend and explained that, yes, Charlie, and he uses the phrase moral blackmail. Charlie spoke about feeling morally blackmailed, but this was done in more of a workshop setting, essentially like it was a debate club, and they were strengthening their debates on the topic of Israel. We can take a listen to Xavier DeRusso in his own words.
And then people are taking things out of context because there was in the article, the hit piece that came out, it talks about how Charlie raised up his phone and had written on Twitter, and he said something like, BB needs to resign or something like that. And he goes, what would happen if I do this? There was discourse, and then there was one woman who sat in the back who said, if you do that, you're indirectly going to empower Hamas. And then Charlie was like...
That part I believe. I believe that response happened to that idea. And the fact that he's admitting that happened, that Charlie Kirk did that, held up his phone and proposed sending out that tweet is very interesting, by the way. I've been one to, remark about the fact that Charlie Kirk did during this stretch have a lot of pro-Israel viewpoints, denying that starvation was going on there and denying that it was a genocide. But that's, again, an eyebrow-raising thing, for sure. Just that he did that.
You have to stop saying like that. He was saying that when you are debating about Israel, you need to stop doing it emotionally. You need to do it logically and factually. Otherwise, you lose the debate. He said it is moral blackmail if you say that somebody saying that a politician is bad, that you're then empowering a terrorist organization. Fair argument.
Agree. Totally agree with that, by the way. I never thought that I would agree with Xavier DeRusso, by the way. A devout Zionist, but that is totally right. And if Charlie Kirk said that, I totally agree with Charlie Kirk. You can criticize Israel, especially because our government toes the pro-Israel, Israel first line on everything. $20 billion sent their direction last year. I think we're on track to do that too. Bankrolling this genocide, being drawn into a war versus Iran that we want no part of. That doesn't threaten the United States, that doesn't have a nuclear weapon. That's all propaganda. It always has been.
It was a fair argument, but it also was a real argument. And you kind of removed the names that were involved in this conversation. Natasha Hausdorff was there. Seth Dillon was there. And Seth Dillon was the one that was applying pressure to him. And Seth Dillon and Josh Hammer didn't jump on him in that moment. Were not happy. They were not happy with Charlie at the end of this weekend in the Hamptons because, again, they saw which way the wind was traveling in terms of his positions on Bibi Netanyahu and Israel. And they were, in fact, being accusatory. And again, you don't have to take it in my words or Xavier's words. I've always had a friendly relationship with Xavier, but we should listen to Charlie's own words, which we have played multiple times, of what happened the day after this little weekend retreat, where he vented to Megyn Kelly his frustrations with him being wrongly labeled anti-Semitic and how it was actually pushing him away and it wasn't good for Israel.
And by the way, he was drifting in the same way the entire populace in the aggregate is, left, right, and center over Israel, especially with younger people not buying this again. And this preceded this meeting at the Hamptons, by the way, that took place on August 4th, I believe it was. I mean, you can see here, Laura Loomer, man, she's bashing Charlie Kirk for speaking out of both sides of his mouth. This was on July 12th, when the war with Iran was hot news here, and that, she's raking him over the coals for not being devoutly neocon enough, not putting the idea of regime change on the table enough, and, likening him to Tucker Carlson, who's, Tucker Carlson. They say he's taking money from Qatar, as if that's the big deal in our political system, and not Israel's unruly and unwise and deplorable influence in our government. Not apex power. It's Qatar. Give me a break. Absurd.
Then, in that one of the big questions that we discovered, or that we asked, and something that we had discovered, was that this weekend was kept hush hush, which is extraordinarily unusual for a Turning Point event. If you're going to fly your influencers out, you want them to influence, obviously. And Xavier offered this explanation for why they didn't post about the weekend until they were rumbled about the weekend. Take a listen.
And then you have the people who are trying to go and say that, oh, then why was the meeting so secretive? The photos were already on my Instagram. The reason we didn't post that in the real time was because of safety. Do you know how many people would have loved to come and slaughter that whole hotel?
Feeling like Justin Bieber because it's not clocking for me. Like, I'm sorry. So first off, you guys never connected to Turning Point USA publicly. The photos that you posted, if you posted it after the event, I don't think that it's because you were fearful that just being a conservative in the Hamptons was going to get you slaughtered. Like, were there Hamas tunnels under the Hamptons? That doesn't make sense. That makes entirely no sense. And we should call out how little sense that makes, especially because one of the influencers did post on August 6th that she was in the Hamptons. Actually, Emily loves America. Emily saves America, pardon me, said when she was fighting with somebody about how little their engagement ring was during this weekend, how do you guys expect to have a house, land, and multiple kids? Be for real. Sorry, I'm MIA. I'm in the Hamptons.
Just think about that. How absurd is that? That they're worried about security at the Hamptons? Like, this is the only time they're fearful of that. Charlie Kirk makes thousands of public appearances. These influencers make thousands of public appearances. And it's at Bill Ackman's property in the Hamptons, or at least Bill Ackman sponsoring it, if not at his property, if it's at that hotel. You know, Bill Ackman sponsoring it probably has security arranged and under wraps because he's made of money. He poops it out. I think he's worth $8 billion. It's very hard to believe, man. This is a stupid excuse, if you ask me. I just do not buy it whatsoever. I'm with Candace.
So are conservatives not allowed to be in the Hamptons without getting slaughtered? Or is it specifically conservative influencers? You said that it wasn't a pro-Israel event, so I guess there's no Israel angle here, which does, of course, there's tons of Zionists in the Hamptons. Bill Ackman among them. So I don't understand. You couldn't post that you were in the Hamptons because you were going to get killed. How?
Yeah, it'll be funny if one of them says, you know, we had death threats. We were worried about anti-Semitism, but it wasn't a pro-Israel event. When their whole line is that anti-Semitism is the biggest problem in the world and we need to put a stop to it. You know, it's a public health crisis, according to RFK Jr. He's tweeted about that multiple times. It's this way to obfuscate and try to take away any culpability for murder and bloodshed and starvation that Israel is committing in Gaza. That's what it is. And, you know, this one wasn't an Israel event that, you know, these hardcore Zionists were all invited to. And that seems to be Ackman's MO and Seth Dillon's MO. Yeah.
Need more information there because that's just silly. And I also love the context of him doing this on PragerU's platform. I obviously worked for PragerU. I know Marissa Straight. I am looking at Marissa Straight right there, a little PR operation to address the points without actually addressing the points and to make it seem like it was nothing. And that's not the reality. You know, Marissa has always been open about the fact that she worked for the IDF intelligence. And like I said, you could sense there was a PR panic when people started speaking about the weekend. I told you guys the truth. That's it. Okay.
Yeah, so did Tucker Carlson. So did others that were close to Charlie. So did this unnamed source who talked to Max Blumenthal. And that seems to comport with what these people are saying, including Candace Owens. And again, I talked about this before in this video, but Max Blumenthal followed up his piece with another excellent piece on September 22nd, where he talks about Robert Shillman, one of the biggest donors to Turning Point USA, pulled his donation because he was upset about Kirk's turn. He wasn't being as pro-Zionist as he would like him to be. And by the way, Kirk described him at one point as his mentor. And this is linked here. In Max's article, he talked about this on X. He said that, you know, he referred to him in that way. And, you know, Tucker did mention in a live segment, you know, giving homage to Charlie Kirk's life, that he knew someone pulled a $2 million donation from Turning Point USA in the last days of Charlie Kirk's life. I'm not sure if it refers to him, but if it doesn't refer to him, that's even more interesting, that there is more people withdrawing donations. If I'm saying it could have been Shilman for all I know, but there's something here, man. This is still a story. Whatever you think about it, whatever you think about the FBI's investigation, Charlie Kirk's final days, was he really drifting away from devout Zionism? Whatever you think, there is some interesting facets to this that really demonstrates the high-level pressure campaign against a private organization, a 401c, a nonprofit. Imagine the pressure campaign against people in government, in the deep state and in Congress and in the executive branch. Miriam Adelson knows that game perfectly.
I don't like the fact that Charlie was literally facing financial threats over his speech, the thing that mattered most to him, right? Fighting for free speech. Even if you disagreed with somebody, you got to make sure that they have a right to express their viewpoints. And what happened to me a year earlier seemed to be happening to him 1 year later. Another thing that I really do not like, and it is bothering me and is eating at me, is the fact that Turning Point will not release the footage, okay? I don't understand it. Every excuse that I have been handed for why they won't release it makes no sense to me. If you are under pressure, if people are starting to look at you funny as an organization, if they're thinking that, whether rightfully or wrongfully, if they are suspecting because they see this footage of someone quickly remove the SD cards, that you guys had something to do with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and you quite literally have footage that in theory should vindicate yourself, why wouldn't you release it? Think about that. It's just in your own capacity. If somebody is saying you are guilty of anything, if they're like, Candace, you are absolutely guilty of breaking into my car, and I'm like, I have a camera right here that shows that I did not break into your car. Would it make sense if I was like, but I'm not going to release that? I'm not going to release that. Because it's not right. It's not right for me to release. What? It makes no sense.
Yeah, I'm with her on this 100%. Transparency is always the best policy, both in PR and in government, if you don't want suspicions headed your way. And there's nothing that seems to, be putting Turning Point in a bad light other than not releasing it. It's not releasing that has raised questions from people looking into this, and rightfully so. This is probably the biggest and, most impactful political assassination since Martin Luther King, I dare say. And thankfully, Candace has seen that footage, but man, I think that should be released. It doesn't seem to serve the benefit of this organization to keep it. Of course, it's their right to do it. It's the right of any property owner not to divulge that information. But when you have, aspersions toward you, rightly or wrongly, and I think a lot of them are wrongly, to be honest, it still behooves you to get out in front of that and be transparent. That's what the government fails about every single time. Because the government revolves around secrecy. It revolves around the elites scheming together in the uniparty to destroy our lives, seize our property, get us into endless wars, shovel money from the middle class to the richest corporations in the world, expand the surveillance state in secret, what Snowden blew the roof off. All those things it does in secrecy without transparency. And it's the lack of transparency that has caused such distrust in government. So why wouldn't that be the case with organizations? And, I don't have a major problem with Turning Point USA, but I still think it would be to their benefit to release that for the reasons Candace is saying.
I don't understand why they would not release this. The idea that it's because, the feds are saying the feds cannot arrest you. Last I checked, the feds cannot bring charges against you for releasing footage that you own. And since when do we trust the feds? Certainly Charlie didn't. He didn't believe we were getting the truth about the Epstein files and things of that nature. So I don't accept that.
I don't either. I mean, they tried to do this with Julian Assange for releasing video recordings of U.S. war crimes in the Middle East during the War on Terror, which is still, ongoing because it's a war versus an abstraction. And thus the government can keep that thing going forever. I guess Yemen and Syria and Iran are part of that too. All those at the behest of Israel, by the way, and the neocons that live here and are tied at the hip to Israel and AIPAC. They tried to take Assange, the brilliant and heroic Julian Assange, down for that. Thankfully, he has, he doesn't have justice, but he is free walking, thankfully, because he pled guilty to journalism, essentially. It's relatively unprecedented for them to do that, but they were citing Espionage Act legislation from World War I to try to take him down. But those circumstances have been few and far between. Whether they would do something like that in this case is just absurd. They would not do this. They would not push charges against Turning Point for releasing that footage.
That said, I also want to be clear that it doesn't mean that every single person that is continuing on in the organization is guilty of murder. I mean, I think we want answers, but we shouldn't be like, this person's definitely a murderer because they're not providing the answers. I've been speaking and I've been seeing a lot of vitriol that's been thrown at Andrew Colvette's way because he is doing press. He is carrying on Charlie Kirk's show. He was already seated on Charlie Kirk's show. He was already there. And I was being genuine when I said he's under a lot of pressure. There's no question. He's the spokesperson for Turning Point USA, and he's grieving somebody that he knows and who was a very close, if not one of his best friends. He saw every day doing the Charlie Kirk show, and he's still got to deal with the same donors that Charlie was dealing with. I mean, it's a lot going on, and until we have all the facts in front of us, until we actually see the footage, I think we should be careful in just thinking that everybody is guilty of something.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with her at the very end there. I mean, when I started to see people say, well, Erica Kirk is responsible for this death or she played some role, I knew that, this is getting way out of hand. This is so ridiculous to make her a scapegoat now for this murder because she didn't handle PR or a mailer that went out the way that some people thought it should go. That's when I believe that, hey, this thing's way off the rails. And the best way to fill the voids of places where there's not much information, and there's not. The feds don't exactly provide it. They're holding a lot close to the vest. Some things that they've referred to in the indictment document they haven't released, including stairwell footage that they released pictures from, but not videos. That would be nice to have. But things like that have filled these gaps, and that's what people are clinging to. Again, rightly so. And it is your right to go down whatever rabbit hole, have whatever opinion you want about this case. But I think the wisest course is to look at those voids where there's not that much information, and instead of filling them with jump to conclusions and absolute claims of certainty and assertions that don't have a positive support for it, meaning like positive proof indicating that's the case, but instead you're skeptical of information, it's way better not to put jump to conclusions in those voids and instead apply reason and logic and deductive reasoning and the Occam's razor, the idea that the most plausible answer to a particular situation is likely what happened. That doesn't mean that has to be what happened, but at least entertaining alternative possibilities to your own narrative. Don't be so dug into your own narrative. Open up your mind a little bit about this. And, I shouldn't have to say that to dissidents that are watching this program. I don't think all of us had to do that to become a dissident. Very few of us, awoke one day and were, the most avid anti-war activist of all time at that point. We were led in that direction by questioning narratives and, weighing them against each other, what the government was saying versus what we saw and the demonstrable proof, and came to a different conclusion than the government. The same thing should happen here, regardless of what side you're on. Not to jump to conclusions in either direction, entertain the facts and logic, and we sure as heck didn't know that much about the Kennedy assassination, 15 days into it. And now we have a much better idea. But if you would have jumped to an assertion about Oswald day one after that, I don't think you would have been right. Even if you ended up right, just to make, rigid claims like that on day two when you don't have positive proof of like CIA involvement, which I do think there was CIA involvement, James Angleton and Dulles, the arch enemy then of Kennedy because he fired Dulles for the Bay of Pigs fiasco. But, what we're looking at here is an interesting episode that shows how the independent media is going to cover these sorts of things going into the future. I applaud Candace for her approach to this. Again, there's some things that I don't always agree with when it comes to her suspicions on certain things and lack of certain suspicions on others. But in some ways, I have to hand it to her. She is, exploring every crevice of this thing and at least providing information where the feds are being either negligent or hostile to doing the same. But that's where I'm at. Let me know where you're at down below. What is the most interesting angle to this? What kind of heat was Charlie Kirk feeling? Do you think that Netanyahu is a bald-faced liar? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, also subscribe to Candace Owens, and please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support my channel, and I'll really appreciate that. It means the world to me if you do that, and thank you to all of my members that have already done that. There's over 120 right now, so thank you profusely. But I'll give you access to all of my videos before they go live on YouTube if you do that too, and hopefully that's a good enough reward. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.